I24NEWS. Syria is accusing Israel of trying to attack Hezbollah facilities in an airstrike. The Syrian regime claims to have shot down most of the Israeli missiles.
EU leaders just met for the first time since the U.S. quit the Iran nuclear deal, as Iran demands a deadline to salvage the agreement. Plus,
we'll see what happens. It could even be the 12th. They very much want to do it. We'd like to do it.
And Trump says his summit meeting with North Korea could be back on. He says his negotiators and representatives of Kim Jong-un have resumed their talks.
From the I24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
Syrian media is reporting that Israeli military forces early Friday morning attacked an airbase near Homs. The facility reportedly houses Hezbollah forces backed by Iran, as well as Syrian soldiers.
The airstrike comes just days after Israel revealed it was the first country in the world to deploy the F-35 fighter jet in combat. Israeli military leaders say they used the expensive radar, avoiding warplane in two recent attacks. Our senior defense correspondent Chai Ben-Ari explains.
Yes, what appears to have been another Israeli strike against targets in Syrian territory, this time in the city of Homs, the Al-Daba military airport. There apparently some sort of Hezbollah presence on the ground, according to reports, likely the target of this strike. The Syrian regime claiming they were able to shoot down the missiles with their S-200 missile defense system. In the past few months, we've been talking about a lot of Israeli strikes against Iranian targets in Syria. Here we're talking about the Iranian proxy, Hezbollah. This may signal some sort of tactical shift on the part of Tehran to be less directly involved and reactivate their proxy. In any case, the planes apparently using Lebanese airspace to carry out this strike, not for the first time again. And that's an interesting link because of this image, a leak to Israeli press earlier this week. It shows the F-35, an Israeli F-35 hovering above the Beirut airport. Of course, in Lebanon, it was displayed to international Air Force chiefs this week at a certain conference here in Israel by Major General Amikam Norkin, the head of the Israeli Air Force. And it's interesting to note that he's come into a lot of criticism right now. Figures in the cabinet calling this unnecessary boasting by the Air Force chief that could complicate Israel in terms of the regional situation. This report by the Israeli news company, a major media outlet here, also noting that even the Israeli Minister of Defense said he was not aware of the decision by the Air Force chief, and this did also not get the approval of the Chief of Staff. It's likely, let's say, that we will see further sightings of the F-35 because Israel has been very vocal of its policy of keeping Iran out of Syria in terms of a military presence on the ground there, as well as the transfer of advanced weaponry towards the Hezbollah group. We'll, of course, keep you updated on that situation.
And then with Chai Ben-Ari reporting from Tel Aviv. For more now, we're joined by our Middle East analyst, Thane Rosenbaum. And Thane, is it boastful for anybody in Israel to say, yes, we did use the F-35, given everybody knows that it's a radar-evading plane, the most expensive in the world, but should they be talking publicly about it?
It's shocking. It's so not in keeping with Israeli policy. It's such a trash-talking maneuver to actually say, look at our plane, it's bigger than yours. But I do think, you know, look, Israel continues to be in a very hostile region. Syria has become really the repository of great regional menace. Everybody is in this war zone of Syria, and I think Israel is constantly trying to send a message to Iran and to Russia and to ISIS and to Assad and to even the Syrian-backed democratic forces that we're here and we're still the biggest air force and biggest army in the region.
But what about Iran sending back a message to Israel? Because back in April, after the attack attributed to Israel on the T4 base, Iran vowed to retaliate, yet we didn't really see something really significant happening.
You know, look, Iran, they're incredible diplomats, but they don't really act, and they haven't really acted. You know, the Israelis do act. The Israelis have put everybody on notice that if you are a proxy of Iran, if you are an Islamic extremist, if you are an existential threat to Israel, if you have genocidal aspirations against Israel, we're going to kill you. We're going to find you, and we now have an F-35 to prove it.
And in fact, that language about killing Iranian proxies that was uttered this week by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who came out with this sort of 12 arguments to Iran, things that they needed to do. So has that given Israel perhaps even more free rein to be aggressive in Syria?
I think the Israelis feel liberated. I mean, let's think about what it's been like during this Trump administration. I feel they do feel the United States has their back. There's an American ambassador to the United Nations that always says the right thing with respect to Israel's position in the global sphere. And I think that they think, look, you know, Hezbollah is an enemy. We don't want them in Syria. We don't want them in Lebanon. We don't want them anywhere. And I think they're going to continue to test this. And I think it's interesting. Yes, it's true that you normally don't hear Israel boast, but I think it has a lot to do with the special circumstances of the war-torn region that is Syria. It is a mess. It's hostile, and with Iran there. And look, you know, you've got Iran on the run. You know, you've got a decertification of the Iran deal. I do think that this has unleashed the Israelis and made them feel much more liberated to pursue these kinds of more aggressive policies.
How long do you think we'll still see Iran on the ground in Syria? Because you mentioned the Russians, they say they don't want to see Hezbollah, they don't want to see Iran over there. And also the Iranians, it's not like the regime has a lot of money to spend right now, especially after the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal.
The problem is Hezbollah. You know, they like that the Iranians like to feel that they're in control of Lebanon. And they are, as long as Nasrallah and Hezbollah are in charge. And the only way for that to happen is to keep that pathway of Syria open. Because if not, Hezbollah would be isolated, and Israel would be to its south. The key has always been that they've had a kind of runway, which is why the Israelis have always felt free to invade Syrian airspace, to attack any convoy of weapons going through Syria to Lebanon. You know, I think that this is really what their connection is for Hezbollah. But I also think that, you know, the fact that, as Tal said, we haven't seen Iran retaliate in any way suggests that maybe they're just saying, look, Hezbollah, you're on your own for this.
It's also not clear that either in Syria or Iran they can possibly retaliate against the F-35. It was built by Lockheed Martin. It took something like 20 years to develop, the most expensive plane in world history. I think the United States sold 9 or 10 of them to Israel. This would be the plane that if Israel ever had to attack, say, Iranian facilities inside Iran, this would likely be the weapon of choice because there isn't Iranian radar that can stop it.
You know, what we saw last night, David, is test flight. You know, the Israelis, one of the reasons why I thought you saw this strange exuberance is because I think they're thrilled. They get a chance to see it. You know, the Israelis continue to be the canary in the coal mine of that region. And they, you know, what's the point of test flying the F-35 unless you can actually use it? And they actually had a free chance to use it because, as you're quite right, they may one day have to use it against Iran.
Thane, you said that Hezbollah is the main threat to Israel on its northern border right now, and Hezbollah's chief Hassan Nasrallah, he delivered a speech today marking the anniversary of Israel's withdrawal from southern Lebanon 18 years ago. He said that Hezbollah is set to win the next round of war. How powerful is Hezbollah right now after engaging in years of civil war in Syria?
This is an interesting point. Look, the question is, why was Hezbollah even in this base, right? Well, they recaptured it 3 years ago from Syrian rebel forces, and that's why they actually have a toehold, a foothold in Lebanon itself. The reality is that they've been stockpiling weapons and to fire against Israel for many, many years. So although they may have been depleting their fighters and they've been taking hits in Syria, there's no doubt the Israelis are concerned about the extent of the weaponry that still exists in Lebanon pointed at Israel.
Thane Rosenbaum, Middle East analyst. Thane, always great to have you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Tal.
In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, thousands of Palestinians demonstrated on this day along the Gaza border. This was the 9th straight Friday of confrontations with Israeli security forces as the Gaza residents continued their so-called March of Return.
Dozens of people were reportedly injured on Friday. The head of Hamas in Gaza has called for the protests to continue into next month, but the violence on the border does seem to be somewhat quietening down. I24 News defense correspondent Daniel Tzemach reports.
We're here near an Israeli border community of Nir Am, the site of a fire. This issue has persisted even after the 2-month-long now mass march of return has dwindled. But the kites that the Palestinians are using, flying over to Israeli territory, have been setting fields like this one ablaze. Maybe the strongest lasting impact of this mass march of return have been these fires here. Fire extinguishing units have been on site, as well as Israeli border police. So while the situation has calmed on the border, these issues are still wreaking havoc on Israeli border communities. Daniel Tzemach, I24 News, Israel-Gaza border.
Coming up on Crossroads, the clock is ticking on the Iran nuclear deal. Iran has given European leaders 1 week to save the agreement.
The parties still in the deal just met for the first time since the U.S. pulled out. European leaders are now stepping up efforts to save the Iran nuclear agreement. The remaining partners in the 2015 deal, including China and Russia, met in Vienna on Friday for the first time since the U.S. pulled out of that deal earlier this month.
Iran is giving the leaders until the end of the month to come up with an economic relief package that would persuade Iran to stay in the deal. But the financial effort is proving difficult given the Trump administration's threats to sanction European companies that do business with Iran.
For more, let's turn to our senior diplomatic correspondent, Nina Larson at the UN headquarters for us. Nina, is there any consensus among the remaining powers in the deal?
Well, yes, there is. There is a common goal, Tal, of keeping this, the original deal, as on track as humanly possible. And there's also a new understanding, it seems, between Moscow and Paris. President Putin hosted Emmanuel Macron in St. Petersburg yesterday, and they seem to be very much on the same page of trying to preserve this deal. The big variable in all of this, of course, is the United States.
And Nina, is the United States working with this group even in an informal basis to try to guide them on where the United States red line is in terms of companies doing business with Iran?
Well, yes, David, there has been a lot of intense diplomacy even before President Trump made that decision to pull out of the deal. And the United States got very, very close to agreement with its European colleagues. But the one big thing apparently was the sunset clause that was allowing Iran to resume their nuclear activity in 2025. But having said all of that, we've got a new Secretary of State, and he met with the German Foreign Minister just yesterday in Washington. And the German Foreign Minister was very pessimistic when he came out of that meeting, saying the United States and Europe at the moment are poles apart.
Back to the talks in Vienna. Nina, what are the main sticking points for Iran?
Well, aside from that sunset clause that no one can seem to agree on, Tal, Iran is being adamant that they absolutely will not include any discussion at the moment, that's at the moment, on the ballistic missile program and also any other wider activities throughout the Middle East. But again, Iran is playing a very smart diplomatic game at the moment. The very fact that this meeting happened in Vienna shows the urgency of all of this. And their foreign minister was in Europe just last week, and China and Russia. There's frantic diplomacy going on behind the scenes. Iran is very concerned, but they've given the EU a very, very tight deadline of the end of next week to come up with some economic reassurances.
Tight indeed. Nina Larson, you'll continue to update us. Thank you. And to discuss further, we're joined by Craig Snyder, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Craig, great to have you here on set. So Iran cares about money. The Iranian regime wants to save the economy, stay in power, but can the European signatories, China and Russia, actually guarantee it without the United States being side of the deal?
Seems very unlikely. What we're seeing here, I think, is the often reported decline of American power and influence in the world, both economically and politically, was premature. We're seeing here how difficult it is when the United States is on one side of a position for even the other great powers of the world to be on the other side. This is very, very challenging, maybe impossible for them to do, given the seriousness that the Trump administration, particularly Secretary Pompeo, has now announced in terms of these sanctions.
Even something like Iran's demand that European powers continue to buy their oil, buy their crude, is that something that is a no-no as far as the Trump administration is considering?
Well, the full extent of the Trump administration's position with respect to Europe and secondary sanctions is not publicly clear. But the rhetoric that's been used publicly so far is very strong, and it would indicate that if you were a European business person, you would have real cause for concern about operating in Iran. And that's what's happening already. In fact, it even happened before Trump officially pulled out of the deal, that European companies, including in the oil sector, have pulled back in anticipation of what the United States might do, even before the United States has actually done it.
So Iran, they're now giving this deadline to the European signatories, but they also somewhat find themselves in a catch, because on one side, if they go back to enriching uranium, then they lose the support from the European signatories, right? But if they do not do so, they will lose their only card going against the U.S. And withdrawing the deal on Iran's side without going back to enriching uranium, that's a win-win for President Trump. So what can they do?
Well, I mean, the Supreme Leader's statement within the last couple of days at least is clear on the face of it. Whether they follow it, we'll see. But they have said that they will go back to enriching uranium if these economic guarantees are not provided. And it seems unlikely that these economic guarantees can be provided. So this could be a kind of a ruse to set the stage for resuming the nuclear activities. What may be the most significant part of all of this, though, is the fact that the United States is on one side of this. Our European allies, the Russians and the Chinese, are collectively on the other side. This is great news for Vladimir Putin, who one of his main goals in the strategy of the world, really, is to separate the United States from Europe. And in this case, we're doing it ourselves.
As far as Iran and whether this is a ruse or not, and despite the threats to actually go ahead and start enriching uranium again if there's no deal with Europe, do you think that they actually would move forward with that, assuming that Europe's not able to come up and meet their demands?
It's impossible to know for sure. My own view is that they will. They need to honor the threat, so to speak, in order to have the credibility that they want in the broader international negotiation.
And then that kicks it back over to the United States and Israel in terms of a possible military option to stop them.
It certainly puts it back on the table. And of course, that was President Obama's thinking to begin with in negotiating the deal originally, that the military option is both dangerous and potentially not workable. And therefore, he felt that this compromise, so to speak, where we only limited nuclear activities, we didn't limit ballistic missiles or other foreign policy adventurism, that was worth taking sort of half the loaf. The whole loaf is now back on the table. The Secretary Pompeo is saying we're going to pursue it across the board, but we can't do it without getting the Europeans to come back our way.
Craig, how do you read Pompeo's statements? Because some do interpret it as a call for regime change in Iran, although the Secretary himself, he stated that it's not one of the U.S.'s objectives in Iran.
Well, I think the not so secret desire of what people would call the hawks in the administration would be to see a different regime in Iran, and it has been that way for decades. But it's not the stated purpose. The stated purpose is to limit certain particular activities, ballistic missiles, activity in Syria and Lebanon, and so on. It is possible, not likely, but it's possible that the Iranians could avoid U.S. efforts for regime change, could in fact maybe even get a guarantee from the United States about not trying to have regime change if they would alter these other behaviors. Problem is, these other behaviors are key to their sense of national purpose, of the purpose of the regime.
I want to ask another hypothetical in terms of how the scenario plays out. Let's just suppose Iran starts enriching uranium. The United States has also threatened from President Trump and Pompeo there would be even more severe consequences if they did that. Yeah. So on top of whatever sanctions the United States has tried to reimpose, does that put the United States on the hook in order to either take some sort of military action, or what could they possibly do short of that after having said do not enrich uranium again?
Well, that is, I think you've hit on sort of the key question. So people who maybe didn't love this deal, the Obama deal to begin with, but who opposed President Trump pulling out of it, the argument they made was, what do you do next? It's easy to pull out, but how do you enforce change on the Iranians, even if you have cooperation from Europe, but especially if you don't? So I think you've raised really the key question, which is what are the policy levers, the additional policy levers that are available to try and enforce a hard line on Iran? And it's not clear what those things are, short of military action, which people understand on all sides of the issue to be potentially catastrophic. This is a major power. In the region, perhaps in some ways even in the world, with an 8,000-year history of civilization, a proud people. The one thing that might, in fact, rally popular support for the Iranian regime among the Iranian people would be a strike from outside. So there's a lot of danger that's been put in play here by the decision from the president. Doesn't mean the decision was wrong, but it means that you have to be prepared sort of to carry out the consequences.
Craig Snyder, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Craig, great to have you in studio. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Still ahead on Crossroads, is the U.S.-North Korea summit back on? Just a day after canceling talks, President Trump now hinting it could still take place next month.
And in Hawaii, toxic gas is reaching dangerous new highs. There's growing concern as geologists say eruptions on Mount Kilauea are showing no signs of dying down. In the relationship between the Trump administration and the North Korean regime, the roller coaster continues. President Trump indicated on this day that his summit meeting could be back on.
Well, the president saying on Friday that he's still open to talks with North Korea's Kim Jong-un next month. It comes after the Korean regime issued a conciliatory statement saying they are willing to meet with the United States at any time. Arlette Saenz has the latest.
Less than 24 hours after calling off his Singapore summit, President Trump says it could happen after all.
We'll see what happens. It could even be the 12th. We're talking to them now. They very much want to do it. We'd like to do it.
It's the latest whiplash surrounding the potential sit-down between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Just yesterday, the president nixed those talks, accusing North Korea of, quote, tremendous anger and open hostility.
This is a tremendous setback for North Korea and indeed a setback for the world.
Today, the president warmly welcomed a conciliatory statement from North Korea's foreign minister, who said they're regretful the summit was canceled and are willing to meet with the U.S. at any time, any format. U.S. officials previously suggested preparations for the summit had stalled. Last week, the North Koreans failed to show up for a meeting with the U.S. and went silent.
We got a lot of dial tones, Senator.
But the Pentagon now seemed to signal planning could be moving forward.
We got some, possibly some good news on the Korea summit where it may, our diplomats can pull it off, may have it back on even.
With the summit back on the table, the art of the deal president says he's aware of the stakes.
Are you concerned that the North Koreans could be trying to play games here? Everybody plays games. You know that.
That was Arlette Saenz reporting.
Let's bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv, to discuss it further. Dan, if everybody's playing games, as the president said, and the president is suggesting that the summit with North Korea may be on again, should we believe that?
I can't tell you what to believe, but we are trying to keep track of whether the chances of having this summit are increasing or decreasing. And as I'm speaking to you now on Friday evening, after so many ups and downs here in Washington, and just about the start of a 3-day Memorial Day holiday weekend, it looks like the chances are increasing. Here's a tweet from President Trump on this day, Friday. Very good news to receive the warm and productive statement from North Korea. We will soon see where it will lead, hopefully to long and enduring prosperity and peace. Only time and talent will tell. But the president's press secretary, Sarah Sanders, says that he wants a real meeting with real content, not just a publicity stunt that could take more time to work out. Yes, before the summit, they'd have to talk about the contents. She said it could happen on June 12th in Singapore, as had been scheduled, or it would be okay at a later date. David and Tal.
Dan, President Trump went to Annapolis, Maryland on this day, spoke at the Naval Academy graduation in front of about 30,000 people. What were the highlights of the speech? Any references to North Korea in his remarks?
No, he didn't clear up the mystery as to whether he's going to have a summit or not, but it could be relevant that he was reminding the world that the United States has a mighty military, which he says has only gotten more powerful, and he was referring to the fact that Congress approved more defense spending that he had urged. I quote from the president's speech to the graduates, midshipmen as they're called. They're becoming Navy officers now. If a fight must come, there is no other alternative but victory, winning. Beautiful words, but that's what it's all about. And also in Trumpian style at the end of his speech, we know that glory will be yours because you are winners. You are warriors, you are fighters, you are champions, and you will lead us only to victory. You know, almost a wartime tone. He is, after all, the commander-in-chief. David and Tal.
And Dan, as we saw, senior officials say that North Korea didn't show up, they didn't stay in touch when it came to planning for the summit. Do we know if they're in touch with Washington right now?
Yeah, White House officials say that now they have been answering the phone. Whatever they were trying to do a week ago, maybe pushed by China to give the United States a hard time, now they are in touch again. And U.S. officials might even go to a planning meeting in Singapore during this weekend. President Trump said on Friday morning, we're talking to them now. It was clear that he felt good about the response from North Korea to his letter that canceled the summit. That response, among other things, said President Trump had made a brave decision to have a meeting with their country's supreme leader, as they call Kim, and this is North Korea speaking, the world needs a summit conference. Tal and David?
I still place my bet on June 12. Dan Raviv, thank you.
Still to come on Crossroads, more than a dozen people were injured in a restaurant bombing in Canada and Ontario. A manhunt is underway for the two suspects who were believed to have set off the blast before they fled.
Plus, Harvey Weinstein turns himself into police. The disgraced movie mogul finally faces court on charges of rape and sexual abuse. Welcome back to Crossroads. I'm Tal Heinrich.
And I'm David Schuster. Let's take a look at some stories making news around the globe. In Canada, surveillance video shows two men believed to be behind the bombing of a restaurant in Ontario. Police say the pair set off an improvised bomb on Thursday night in an Indian restaurant and then fled the scene.
15 people were injured in the blast. 3 of those are in critical condition. At this stage of the investigation, there is reportedly no indication that it was a terrorist attack or that it was a hate crime.
The polls are now closed in Ireland after more people than expected turned out to vote on a referendum to repeal a very divisive abortion law.
Early polls are already showing a landslide victory for those in favor. Abortions in Ireland have effectively been illegal for 36 years since a controversial amendment was added to the country's constitution.
The results are expected to be announced Saturday evening, Ireland time. The Netherlands and Australia are accusing Russia of being behind the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17.
The Boeing 777 was shot down by a missile 3 years ago over war-torn eastern Ukraine. On Thursday, international investigators concluded that the missile came from a Russian military brigade, but Moscow continues to deny any involvement.
All 298 people on board that aircraft died, including Dutch and Australian nationals. The Netherlands and Australia plan to submit their complaint against Russia to an international court.
And back in the United States, in Hawaii, geologists are warning of new risks from the continuously erupting Mount Kilauea.
Boaters along the Big Island's coast may face shooting rock fragments as the lava explodes into the ocean. Inland, the dangers include boulders that have been hurled by new explosions. Toxic gas and molten rock are also burning through jungles.
U.S. Marine helicopters are standing by in case more communities need to be evacuated. Dozens of homes have already been destroyed and thousands of people evacuated since the volcano first erupted 3 weeks ago. And still in the United States, movie mogul Harvey Weinstein turned himself into New York police on Friday, charged with rape and sexual abuse.
This comes 7 months after dozens of women came forward accusing the powerful Hollywood producer of sexual assault and misconduct. Maggie Rulli has the story.
This morning, Harvey Weinstein has turned himself in to authorities.
Mr. Weinstein will enter a plea of not guilty.
Surrendering to police after an NYPD investigation into allegations by 2 women led to charges of rape and a criminal sex act.
We intend to move very quickly to dismiss these charges. We believe that they are constitutionally flawed.
Rose McGowan was one of Weinstein's first accusers.
I have to admit, I didn't think I would see the day that he would have handcuffs on him.
Her allegations are past the statute of limitations, but today's charges come from 2 other women, including former aspiring actress Lucia Evans. She told The New Yorker back in October that Weinstein overpowered and forced her to perform a sexual act during a business meeting at his Manhattan office in 2004, adding, "I said over and over, I don't want to do this. Stop. Don't."
When I first began speaking to Harvey Weinstein's accusers, they were correctly terrified.
Ronan Farrow first broke the story that has been with Weinstein's accusers since the beginning.
Now we live in a universe in which it is conceivable that survivors speak on an issue like this about someone that powerful and they're heard.
That was Maggie Rulli reporting. For more on that, let's bring in litigation attorney Seth Berensweig. Seth, thank you for joining us. Walk us through the judicial procedure. What is expected for Weinstein now, and what's the time frame?
Sure. So this has been an incredible turn of events that we've seen today. Harvey Weinstein went from flying high as one of the most powerful moguls in Hollywood to landing in a New York courtroom today in handcuffs in front of a judge fighting for his freedom. Today he was arraigned and he entered a plea of not guilty. What will happen next procedurally is that he will be subject to electronic monitoring, which will probably be strapped to his ankle. He will be restricted in travel. He will only be able to stay essentially in the immediate New York area. He has posted a $10 million bond, 10% of that in cash, and they'll have a status update and a conference in the case in approximately 2 months. I think that the defense strategy in this case is going to be pretty clear. They have to essentially divide and conquer. They've got right now 2 accusers, 2 victims in this case. The grand jury in New York is still meeting, so it's going to be an uphill battle for Mr. Weinstein and his legal counsel in this case.
Seth, the defense team has said that Mr. Weinstein insists this was all consensual, that the women did not engage in anything that they did not want to do. Is this a very difficult sort of case to prove that it was not consensual?
Well, that's going to be a tough road to hoe. And I think that his attorney made it pretty clear today in front of the microphone that they're basically going to use what they're calling the casting couch defense. Basically, and a lot of people can consider this pretty unseemly, but it really goes to the legal defense of consent. Were the people who were allegedly assaulted by Harvey Weinstein forced against their will into sexual activities with him, or was it something where they really just, sort of relented on the casting couch as a little bit of an exchange with him to be able to enhance their careers? That's a very risky defense because, first of all, I don't think it has a lot of credibility. As one of the victims has clearly stated, and I'm sure many others have as well, there are environments and contexts in these kinds of facts that show that the person is being forced to do something against their will. And every time that you continue to have more victims that are going to be coming through in this case, as are now speaking with the grand jury every day in New York, it's going to be harder and harder for Mr. Weinstein to be able to defend himself. Look, for example, at what happened to Bill Cosby. When he had a retrial in his case and there were multiple victims that came in, he was convicted. So I think it's going to be a very difficult defense, and it's going to be a very significant uphill battle for him.
The Weinstein case is what started the Me Too movement. How do you think people inside the courtroom, the jury, the judges will be able to isolate themselves from what's going on outside the courtroom and ignore the noises?
Well, that's a great question, and I think you hit on a very interesting issue that Mr. Weinstein's attorney spoke directly on that point this morning, because he said that one of the things that they have to be able to do is to find a fair and impartial jury, and that's really defense lawyer code for laying out an appealable issue as to whether they were able to have a jury pool that is not infected or influenced by this Me Too movement. Look, we all know that the Me Too movement, which was probably triggered by his alleged conduct, is something that really is nationally and internationally known. They're going to have to find a jury that is not influenced by this. Harvey Weinstein has a constitutional right to have a fair jury in front of 12 people in New York. That's going to be a challenge, and that's something that his lawyer has already teed up as an issue that I predict may ultimately end up on appeal. It's going to be very difficult for Mr. Weinstein to defend these cases, and I predict that with the grand juries that are sitting both in New York and Los Angeles right now, this is really chapter 1 of a problem that's going to continue to get more serious for him.
And it's probably also chapter 1 of our conversation with you, Seth Berensweig. Thank you very much. Coming up on Crossroads, our correspondent brings us the coolest futuristic gadgets and gizmos on display at the Viva Technology Conference in Paris.
Plus, Prince William is set to make history. He's heading to Israel next month, marking the first official visit for a member of the royal family. All the details just ahead.